Hello, and welcome to the webinar on plant genetics, breeding, and variety selection in organic systems. This is webinar number 5 in the Soil Health and Organic Farming webinar series. This series of 9 webinars is organized by the Organic Farming Research Foundation and hosted by eOrganic with funding from the Clarence Heller Foundation. I'm your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic. eOrganic has many articles, videos, and webinars about organic farming and research, and you can find all of them on our website at extension.org and on the eOrganic YouTube channel. This webinar will be presented by Mark Schoenbeck, who is a research associate at the Organic Farming Research Foundation. Mark has worked for the last 31 years as a researcher, consultant, and educator about organic and sustainable agriculture. He's also worked for many years with the Virginia Association for Biological Farming. So now I'm going to hand over the screen control to you, Mark, and we can get started with the presentation. Let me see.
Well, in this webinar, we'll be talking about how the genetics of the crops and varieties that you are planting can actually directly or indirectly support soil health building. And this is all based on research that has been conducted for organic systems, including a lot of plant breeding. Okay, well, in 2015, the Organic Farming Research Foundation conducted a survey of well over 1,000 organic farmers across the United States to identify their top research priorities. And nearly 3/4 of the respondents to the survey cited soil health as a top priority for organic research. And in addition, both in the survey itself and in a series of listening sessions around the country, organic farmers identified specific needs in terms of crop cultivars. Need cultivars that will thrive in organic systems, obviously. They want ones that are easy to grow. And one aspect of this is that efficient utilization of plant nutrients from organic sources, from soil organic matter itself, resisting the major diseases in a particular region, and also resilience to other stresses such as weather extremes, weeds, pests, drought, etc. And of course, the variety has to meet market demands for quality and nutritional value and produce a financially viable yield. And just an example, one of the listening sessions, one of the farmers stated that today's wheat varieties are, quote, short wheat, short root systems, lower protein and mineral content, higher nitrogen needs, and are not really what we need. And this farmer expressed the need for breeding that focuses on strong root systems that interact with healthy soil. That's a very intriguing concept, and it turns out there's a lot of good science that backs it up. First question is, how do crop genetics interact with soil health? And there are some direct and indirect impacts. For example, if heritable traits simply facilitate production, organic production, that means that more farmers will be able to stay in organic production or to enter organic production or expand their organic acreage because it's now possible to grow crops successfully with that system. And this includes the resilience to locally prevalent stresses. It could be drought, it could be a tendency towards flooding, it could be certain diseases. Another way that crop genetics relates to soil health is whether it will reduce the need for inputs. And 3 particular inputs can impact soil health. If there's a great need for irrigation, there's more chance for runoff or ponding or leaching of nutrients from having to apply water to keep the crop going. Another one is nutrients. Even organic fertilizers, if you have to load on large amounts, this does build up nutrients, soluble nutrients to high levels, and that can compromise both soil health and water quality. And in addition, another input is tillage and cultivation for weed control. So if a crop has greater resilience to weeds, ability to tolerate them or actually outcompete them, then you won't have to till as often, you won't have to cultivate as often, and that is really important for protecting soil quality. And there are ways in which plants can directly protect soil and build organic matter and improve its physical and biological condition. And of course, you want good market appeal. And this corn, this variety of corn that was developed fairly recently through a farmer participatory research a reading network called the Northern Organic Vegetable Improvement Collaborative, who gets kissed. This is a sweet corn that's open pollinated. It's early, so it'll mature in northern climates such as Wisconsin. It has resistance to the prevalent diseases and also tolerance to the cool soil, and it offers great flavor. A lot of early sweet corns are kind of flat in flavor, and this one is actually quite good. This is an example of the kind of crop genetics that we need for soil health. Here's an example of a crop that's easy to grow organically, South Anna Butternut Squash. This was developed by a farmer breeder in Southwest Virginia, actually Central Virginia, excuse me. This is Edmund Frost, who has been working in collaboration with some other plant breeders. He's a farmer and seed grower, and he crossed a butternut squash, a Waltham butternut, with a very ancient related squash called Seminole pumpkin, and then selected it over 8 or 9 generations to develop this new line of butternut. Has tremendous vigor, resistant to downy mildew, which will take Waltham out very quickly, has excellent flavor and very long storage shelf life. So any of these traits will make, that are listed on the left here, will make a crop easier to grow organically, simply, and to market organically, of course. That's the important thing at the end there. But that early vigor, the rapid start, getting the seeds out of the ground, that is a very important trait for organic producers who don't use, for instance, fungicide-treated seeds. One of the traits that we're looking for is just needing fewer inputs. And this is the main thing, is that you want crop varieties that can utilize nutrients from organic sources, from just the turnover of a soil organic matter, from cover crop residues, and things like that, especially on anything that can be recycled on farm. And as a result, they will need less fertilizer. And organic fertilizers are actually not expensive to purchase. And when they're used heavily, they can adversely affect soil or water quality. And efficient utilization of water, it means it needs less irrigation. And varieties that will just either outcompete the weeds, just grow over them, and shade them out, or simply tolerate the presence of weeds without losing a lot of yield. You won't need to cultivate as often to get that crop established. This is a variety of red cob dent corn that I grew just in my own garden in Virginia, in Floyd, Virginia, in the Appalachian region, and just gave it a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of feather meal, maybe a few 100 pounds per acre, which is like 40 pounds of nitrogen. So I really was not fertilizing it like Corn Belt field corn, and it did very, very well. Another variety that I grew was called Bloody Butcher, which really impressed me because it had that seedling vigor. I started it in cells because I knew it had a slightly later maturing date, and I wanted to get it out quickly. And by the time the plants, 11 days after seeding them, the plants were 6 inches tall. And when I pulled the plugs out, there were 8 or 10-inch taproots extending, dropping down out of that cell. So they got off to a great start. Now, I wanted to make a point here is that I'm talking about corn varieties that do well in Southwest Virginia. If you're up in Wisconsin or you're out in an arid zone like New Mexico, they may not be at all suited. So you really want to shop locally when you're looking for good seed for organic systems. So here's an example that I think could revolutionize corn growing. You see that picture on the right. On the left is a standard Corn Belt hybrid, which in intensive conventional systems would be standing 8 feet tall and providing you with 200, 225 bushel per acre yields. And on the right is a line of corn that the Mondawmin Institute, Dr. Walter Goldstein and his colleagues have developed, crossing some land races from Mexico and Central America that have high levels of nitrogen use efficiency with standard non-GMO Corn Belt hybrids, and resulted in a highly efficient corn. And this is grown on a low fertility tropical soil without much added fertilizer. And you can see the difference in just the vigor of the crop. And basically, even in conventional production systems, these new hybrids will require about half as much nitrogen as a standard hybrid. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria are are hosted in the root zone. It's not a tight symbiosis like in a legume, but it's in the rhizosphere, or the root zone of the corn crop. The free-living nitrogen bacteria proliferate, and they can provide up to half of the corn's nitrogen needs. The yields are competitive, and the protein quality and content is quite a bit higher, significantly higher than the standard corn belt hybrids. And this is very important to organic poultry growers because this protein provides the scarce amino acid methionine, which until now has to be supplemented in poultry diets. And one of the things about these new lines of corn is they have a large root system, which enhances their drought tolerance as well as their capacity to acquire nutrients. And here's the yield from the standard corn and from the nitrogen efficient corn on low nitrogen soil. And one of the things that Dr. Goldstein and his colleagues have discovered through an extensive review of the literature is that through decades of breeding, today's modern corn hybrids have a modified root microbiome. Their root zone hosts a different range of microorganisms so that the nitrogen fixers are not encouraged, and instead a certain species of fusarium. Now, fusarium, that's known for having a lot of pathogenic fungi. These are not pathogenic fusaria, but they do compromise the corn's capacity to fix nitrogen and to utilize nitrogen from organic sources. It's a microbiome adapted to high input conventional systems so it's dependent on that heavy input of fertilizer. And even just a few generations of breeding and selection in organic systems can improve that whole soil microbiome plant genetics relationships. The Mondawmin Institute seed is now available through contracting agreements to farmers and scientists. It's through a seed company, Nokomis Gold Seed. The information will be in the supplemental notes that will go with the webinar. So here's another example of growing tomatoes on less water. If you look at a seed catalog, there's one called Arkansas Traveler that says yields flavorful tomatoes in drought and high heat, where many other varieties fail. Now, granted, this is from the viewpoint of Arkansas, so it may not necessarily show drought tolerance in a really semi-arid area like New Mexico or inland California. However, that is a flag that it tends to be a drought-tolerant variety. And some California growers are actually dry farming tomato, where they greatly reduce irrigation. They just irrigate the crop long enough to get it well established, and then they let it grow on residual moisture. And the result is a smaller yield, slightly smaller yield, but really good flavor. Just you're concentrating the sugars and the other desirable flavor traits in the tomato, so it's not as watery. And they found there are certain varieties that do particularly well in this system, early girl and new girl, and they have very deep, vigorous root systems that access subsoil moisture. So heritable drought resilience is seen in a wide range of vegetables and grain crops. In fact, we know just from the fact that there are major breeding efforts by International Rice Research Institute and an International Dryland Systems Breeding Program, and another international agency, CIMMYT. It focuses on wheat and maize. And they're working a lot with drought tolerance, which is extremely important in many developing countries and tropical areas. And if you're looking at seed catalogs closer to home, you see drought-hardy cultivars of pepper, okra, lima bean, and many other vegetables. And I can verify this lima beans grew in our garden, and it wasn't a terribly dry summer, but I didn't irrigate it that much, and it did very well. Okay. Here's another one of the farmer plant breeder networks that's been funded through the Organic Farming, Organic Research and Extension Initiative of the USDA. Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture just received its second round of funding from REI. And they have been gathering cultivars and breeding lines from around the world, and they found heritable variation in earliness of emergence and the vigor of the seedlings. in the architecture of the above ground part of the plant, the canopy height, the width, the density, which is important for weed suppression, also in resistance to leaf blight, and also to several pest nematodes, a couple of the different root knot nematodes, which can seriously affect carrots. And they're now finding genetic variation in its ability to enter into a beneficial interaction with soil microorganisms. And of course, flavor, color, nutritional value, all the market traits. So in addition to going after the disease and weed resilience and the early vigor, this project is looking at all the different colors of carrots and aiming to maintain high flavor and good keeping quality and good yields. And there are farm participatory trials in several locations around the United States. So weed competitive carrots. This is a quote from one of the reports at the end of the first round of funding of the Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture. Lines that emerged in form of full canopy earlier than others resulted in the greatest yield in the presence of weeds. And they also had the ability to suppress weeds. And they concluded that just selecting for lines that show these traits as an excellent can be an excellent weed control tool, weed management tool for organic and low input systems. And in fact, I came to a somewhat similar conclusion when I first started gardening here in the Southern Appalachians. I love this variety of carrots called Danvers because it would form a big top, and I'd only have to hoe once or twice instead of 3 or 4 times to get it established. And then because of that large photosynthetic area, it would continue to grow and fill large sweet carrots. I could plant it in August and get beautiful big carrots in November, even though the days were getting short. And then all of a sudden I noticed I started losing crops that they would just die of this kind of blackish blight on the leaves. Well, Danvers is very susceptible to alternaria leaf blight, which is the #1 disease in carrots. Fortunately, the CIOA project has identified lines that have both resistance to alternaria and that large top that improves flavor and yield and weed tolerance, weed competitiveness. So in addition to being able to thrive on low nutrient inputs and outcompete the weeds, a lot of crops have the ability to directly protect and build soil life and build soil and feed the soil life. Any plant does this. So the more biomass, the more vigor that you have in a crop, the more that benefit you're going to get. And since roots are especially important for providing food for the soil life and for building long-term stable organic matter, the deep extensive root systems are especially important. Abundant root exudates that have both quality and quantity of that root exudates that will feed the soil organisms, and also enhanced association with desirable organisms, like we saw that example with the nitrogen efficient corn versus the modern varieties. And this is just a diagram showing the ways that plant breeding can select for improved effects on the soil. You get a fast closing canopy. If your crop closes canopy 2 weeks after planting and you get a torrential rain at 3 weeks, you're not going to get the kind of crusting and erosion as if you had a slow starting crop and you had wide spaces between the rows. Meanwhile, if it is contributing a lot of biomass and organic matter to the soil through exudates and just root turnover, it's feeding the soil life, it's building tilth. It's that active turnover that builds the soil structure, it keeps the crumb structure. And also the roots are the most efficiently converted to long-term stable organic matter. Like when you have a plant residue, and you say you have a ton of root biomass and 2 tons of above ground, 40% of that root biomass becomes organic matter that lasts at least a year, whereas it's only 15 to 20% for the top. Now, there is, of course, a trade-off. If you just breed a crop just to feed the soil, you may have less marketable yield. And this trade-off is something called harvest index. And in the past, breeders have just focused so much on harvest index that they started looking at these soil feeding traits, the massive canopy, the deep, extensive root systems, the heavy root exudates, as wasted effort. But as long as you reserve enough to get a good marketable yield, you then want a crop that's going to also be building the soil. And in fact, those two traits, vigor, just overall vigor, and yield, do tend to correlate with each other. So it's really helpful to breed for both. So when you have that deep, extensive root system that I mentioned, you get enhanced nutrient uptake, and you're building that stable organic matter. Another thing about deep root systems is they will break through and relieve hardpan. Even naturally occurring hardpans that occur in some of the southeast coastal plain soils. There's kind of a leached out horizon that tends to pack down between the biologically rich topsoil and the minerally rich deeper subsoil where the clays have leached in our soils. You get cover crops that can break through that. Greatly enhances the capacity of the next crop to tap those deep moisture and nutrient reserves. Another thing that happens is if there's been a crop that was overfed and there's excess nitrate in the soil profile, if you get a cover crop like pearl millet or tillage radish, or if you get even a production crop that has been selected for a deep, extensive root system, it will recover a lot of that excess nitrate all the way down to 4, 5, even 8 feet, so that it does not enter the groundwater and is not lost from the production system. So there was another study, it was actually a review article by a fellow by the name of D.B. Kell in 2011, and the full reference will be in your notes that go with the presentation. He found evidence in a number of studies that root depth, root mass, and architecture, the degree of branching, are heritable traits, and that it really makes sense to select crops for vigorous root systems. He was looking at it from the point of view of sequestering carbon and helping to slow climate change by putting more carbon back into the ground. But it has many other applications as well. He noted that many modern cultivars only go 2 or 3 feet down, but those same species of plants have the genetic capacity with proper breeding and selection to go twice as deep or more. And of course, you have that improved water and nutrient use efficiency if your root system is larger and deeper. This is an anecdotal example from my own yard. Again, this is a variety of lettuce called New Red Fire. And I was noticing when I was setting out the lettuce plants, I just have a backyard garden, so I have a flat full of 5 or 6 different varieties of lettuces for variety of color and flavor, and I'm setting it out, and I noticed, boy, all the New Red Fires have this nice, thick, heavy root ball, and a lot of the others, there's barely enough root for the mix to hang on to it, and I'm almost bare roots planting them. And another time, I had set this one extra plant out just kind of by itself, and it kind of got neglected during a fairly hot spell in summer, and I came back, and it was wilted pretty much flat on the ground. And I said, oh, well, I lost that one. And I said, oh, I'll dump a gallon of water on it and see what happens. I came back and it looked like you see it in the picture, and we picked it a week later and it was still very good to eat. And I said, well, this is really something, this is anecdotal, but it is something that, for instance, a lettuce breeder or a farmer trying to find the best varieties for his or her circumstance would want to look at and say, oh, well, this is a real possibility. There are probably other varieties. I know that the summer Batavian lettuces are very resilient to heat. They bolt very slowly, similar bolting time to this one. So there again, there's some potential for breeding just for more heat tolerance in lettuce by looking at the root system. Another aspect of this plant breeding factor in soil health is the effective teamwork with soil microbes. And there's more and more research that's just showing this capacity of the plant to interact with desirable organisms is just vital for organic agriculture, for sustainable agriculture, and really just the long-term survival of our food system and of the human race. Because if we have plants that can work effectively with soil microbes, it fends off diseases, it greatly reduces the amount of fertilizer you have to add to keep the crop going. And one of the things that's interesting is that there are specific, in addition to just the goodies, like the proteins and the sugars and all the things that microbes like to eat that roots give off, they give off specific chemical signals that say, okay, I want this type of microorganism to proliferate. I want this nitrogen fixer. I want this, now I'm being very anthropomorphic, but this is kind of how it works in effect. Plants vary in their capacity to interact beneficially with mycorrhizae. I mean, there's obvious differences between species and plant families, But there are also evidence that there might be variation within a species among varieties and breeding lines. And part of that is in the quality and the quantity of the root exudates themselves. Here's a fascinating example. It came out of another one of the REI-funded farmer researcher breeding networks. This is called Tomato Organic Management Improvement, or TOMI. And it's really an IPM approach to tomato disease management. They're looking at best use of NOP-allowed fungicides with emphasis on biofungicides and reduced use of copper, but also looking at plant genetics and the potential to breed for resistance to not just one disease, but to a wide range of diseases. One of the problems with a lot of the disease resistance traits that have been bred in the past is that they are a single gene that creates a almost ironclad immunity to a single pathogen. And when that one pathogen has been a big, big problem for a given crop, it makes sense in the short run anyway to just go ahead and find one of these so-called vertical resistance genes. But what happens is a pathogen, especially if it's something like one of the water molds like downy mildew or Phytophthora root rot or late blight in tomato, which is what you see here in this picture, is that these pathogens will evolve around the resistance gene and regain their virulence against the crop. So then it becomes this arms race. You got to find more resistance genes and you pile them on top of each other, but they're all based on this vertical mechanism. So another approach is to look for what's called horizontal resilience or tolerance or horizontal resistance or resilience. And what that does is it doesn't make the plant immune, but it greatly reduces the virulence of the disease. And if you have several genes involved in conferring resistance or tolerance, it is much harder for the organism to suddenly evolve the ability to be fully virulent. And already the TOMI project has developed a number of advanced breeding lines which are ready to be tested and perhaps released in the next few years, which are resistant to 4 or 5 major tomato diseases: verticillium wilt, early and late blights, septoria, and something else called gray mold. And now, in addition to that, they have discovered a new mechanism of resistance, it's actually not new. It's been known for quite a while, but they're now working with this induced systemic resistance. That's when a beneficial soil organism, in this case a fungus called Trichoderma harzianum, in the root zone stimulates a plant defense that makes it much more resistant to foliar diseases. So you have this organism growing in the soil associating with the tomato root, and then the foliage is then much less subject to this terrible late blight, which can wipe out a crop in 10 days if you have susceptible varieties. So one thing they found is that different tomato lines differ greatly in their capacity to respond to the trichoderma with this ISR response. And it turns out it's the older land races. They had a land race called Columbia that showed a really strong response. But even a modern disease-resistant hybrid that was developed for organic systems, it has horizontal resistance to 3 major diseases called Iron Lady. It showed only a weak response, ISR response. So this is a whole new area where we can add yet another mechanism for disease resistance, and it's through the interaction of the root system with the soil life. All right, so it's other examples. The Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture project is now looking at an endophytic microbe. This is something that lives inside the roots of the carrot that will actually protect the plant from this alternaria leaf blight, which is, as I said, was one of the worst diseases in tomatoes. In carrots, excuse me. And they've also found there's also another project which OFRF is funding to members of this same plant breeding team to look at genetic variation in the association with mycorrhizal fungi. So there's a potential of developing carrots that have enhanced association with mycorrhizal fungi, which, by the way, protect the roots from soil-borne diseases, from root rots, in addition to improving nutrient and water uptake, and to improve the carrot's capacity to host these beneficial microbes that ward off the leaf blight. Okay, well, cover crops, these are crops that are grown specifically to build soil health. So it makes sense to breed them to maximize their soil health benefits. And indeed, there is known documented genetic variability in overall vigor and biomass, which of course means translates to organic matter, capacity to fix nitrogen. That's again that capacity of the plant to interact with organisms, in this case, the Rhizobium symbiont. Cold hardiness varies considerably. Flowering date, there are different strains of vetch that flower later or earlier, same with rye, same with several other cover crops. And ease of termination. There are some vetch varieties that you run the roller crimper over them and they'll just bounce right back up and laugh at you and create a headache in your next crop. And others that if you hit them at the right time at late flowering, it actually crimps them and terminates them. Weed suppression, there's some variation in that, mostly related to the vigor, but perhaps also to some extent to allelopathy, which is a release of chemical substances that suppress the weeds. Disease and pest nematode suppression, that's one that's a lot of variation among varieties. And then water use efficiency of the cover crop, and that gets important in drier regions. So some heritable traits, some examples. Fava beans, there's a study out in the Pacific Northwest. Most fava beans freeze, kill at about 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And they found some lines that will actually overwinter through 0 or even 10 degrees below 0. And hairy vetch is normally difficult to overwinter in the coldest parts of the Midwest, but some on-farm produced seed from Minnesota turns out that it can overwinter in their severe winters. Maturity date, a Bruzzy rye heads about 3 weeks earlier for other rye varieties. There's a variety of vetch, Purple Bounty, that will flower a couple of weeks before other vetches. And it's also fairly easy to kill by roll crimping. So the OREI has funded a project led by Dr. Steve Mirsky and his colleagues at the USDA Agriculture Research Service in Beltsville, Maryland. Is a big research center. They have had long-term farming system trials there for at least 10 or 20 years. In any case, they have now just received a second round of funding to breed hairy vetch, crimson clover, and Austrian winter field pea for organic systems in several distinct regions around the country. The upper South and mid-Atlantic and Pacific Northwest and parts of the Midwest as well. And they're really focusing on several farmer breeding priorities: nitrogen fixation, winter hardiness, early vigor and biomass so that you get that early season weed control. And also the timing of flowering and maturity, because if you want to plant a late crop, you want to grow a cover crop biomass well into the spring. You want it to mature fairly late. If you want to plant an earlier crop, like you want to get in for a full season field corn or early sweet corn, you want to be able to terminate it somewhat earlier. And it means it needs to be in full bloom to be able to terminate without tillage. And the project also is definitely aiming to develop and release new cultivars, regionally adapted, and to establish this as a long-term endeavor. So it's partnering both with university and farmer groups. I know it's, I believe it's partnering with Practical Farmers of Iowa. A lot of farmer participatory breeding and evaluation, and using NRCS plant materials centers from around the country. So let's look at some of the challenges in finding the best cultivars for building a healthy soil and also for making a living as an organic farmer. Very important. So I tell you, there's nothing worse than soil health than to have farmers go out of business and it sprout parking lots and the like. So that is why I keep coming back to just keeping the farmer in business as well as keeping the soil directly fed. The first challenge: today's crop varieties are just not designed for organic systems. So that's a sweeping statement, but most of them are not. This is a quote from a study out of the Organic Seed Alliance and other colleagues. Cultivars are most productive under the conditions for which they were bred. So if they're selected in a highly intensively managed conventional system with lots of synthetic fertilizer and crop protection chemicals, they will not respond well to being planted in an organic field with high organic matter but very little added fertilizer and left to fend for itself against the weeds and the pests. And one thing is that today's broccoli cultivars, they can be grown organically very successfully, and they require over 200 pounds per acre of nitrogen from organic sources or inorganic sources, either way, to get to optimum yield. And that's actually the economic optimum. Because it's a high value crop, you're getting $6 or $8 worth of broccoli for every dollar worth of nitrogen you add. However, this nitrogen is not efficiently used. There's a lot of leaching and denitrification, and maintaining such high levels of nitrogen in the soil may not be very good for soil health per se. There is actually evidence that if you maintain high levels of plant available nitrogen, the soil life will actually shift, and you will burn up organic matter, and you will reduce the soil's ability to provide nutrients to the crop from soil organic matter. And those are important soil health parameters. Another challenge is the cultivars are often not adapted to locale, and choices are often limited. And that's a lot because of the consolidation in the seed industry and also the privatization of a lot of genetic materials. And the private breeders, they kind of focus on large targets that they can sell lots of. Like if you're going to invest $150 million to develop a new GMO variety, which is about what it costs these days, you're going to want to look at something like field corn, and a field corn that's adapted to the whole corn belt, and maybe even to other corn, secondary corn growing regions like in the Great Plains or West Coast or East Coast. You don't want to focus on developing a tomato variety that's going to perform really well in North Carolina when you take those very highly expensive, investment intensive approaches to developing new varieties. So that means that the major crops, the commodity crops themselves, it's hard to find cultivars that are suited for organic systems and that are suited for a particular locale because they have not been developed. Another challenge, public plant breeders are an endangered species. And this is because with the growth of the private industry-driven breeding and genetically modified crop industry, there's been less and less financial support and funding for public breeding efforts through the land-grant universities and through USDA research stations. So there's actually been an alarming decline in the numbers of university and other public plant breeders. It's almost as alarming as watching the decline in certain threatened and endangered species of wildlife. So there's an urgent need to get the new generation of plant breeders established. And luckily, through the Organic Seed Alliance and through another program that I'll talk about a little later, and now through the REI funding these farmer breeder networks, we're beginning to check that decline. And we really need to keep working on this, but there's a little bit of hope in this picture. The other challenge is intellectual property rights and farmers' rights. So one approach is the Organic Source Seed Initiative. That South Anna variety that I showed you and some of the other varieties that have been developed by these farmer breeder networks are considered open source. And that means farmers have the 4 seed freedoms. Farmers and researchers and gardeners are free to grow, share, sell, or trial and study the seed, and they can use it to breed new lines. And there's only one requirement. The only restriction is anything that you develop from OSSI germplasm must remain open source. So if I went and took South Anna butternut and went up to, let's say, Maine, I just said, I'm going to develop North Anna butternut, and I'm going to just select it so that it matures in 60 days instead of 120 and still maintains all the other great traits, and then decide I'm going to make my entire retirement on it and I'm going to privatize it. Well, I wouldn't be able to do that. This has to stay open source. So a quote that I really like is from a breeder with Fedco seeds, which is up in Maine.
Oh, and he also has his own company, Wild Garden Seeds. I just wanted to mention that.
Okay. Yeah. Frank Morton. Okay. So he said, I wish my work could be shared, not monopolized. And this is a wonderful, it's very inspiring. And the breeders have to make a living too. So we have to balance this intellectual property issue with the breeder's right to make a decent living at their craft. Very important. So how do we do this? If you're totally open source, how do you make sure there's enough funding for future research? Well, the growth of the REI is helpful. If we get greater funding, we'll get a little bit more there, but we're going to need a lot more coming in. So there are various ways to set up a licensing agreement between the university or the nonprofit plant breeders or the USDA breeders and the vendors and the end users of seed, so that there's a reasonable return, like a 10% royalty perhaps, that would go back into ongoing breeding projects. And it's a very complicated area that I'm not that familiar with. There's many pros and cons to the royalty system. The Nokomis Gold Seeds that's marketing the Mondawmin nitrogen-efficient corn is developing a model that is somewhat along these lines, so that farmers remain relatively free to use and to propagate and to continue to improve the germplasm. But there is that royalty, just that small percentage that goes back to the original originator of the germplasm. Another level is the Plant Variety Protection Act, which has been around for several decades. This is somewhat more restrictive. You can save seed for use on farm, but you can't sell it. Like if I had a PVP pepper and I grew a bunch of seed, I could give it to my neighbors, but I can't sell it. I can't make a living off of it as long as that PVP protection is there. And I could use the existing PVP variety to develop new lines. So the restrictions are not that severe. Now, the next level is the utility patent. This is what the major seed companies that are developing genetically modified and other high-tech varieties. On-farm seed saving is prohibited. The farmer can only enters into a contract with the vendor, with the patent holder, that they may use the seed they buy to grow a crop and sell the crop as food or feed or fiber, and period. That's it. And even germplasm used by researchers is restricted. It's not completely eliminated, but it's quite restricted. Okay, how do we meet these challenges? Well, we can work together. And this is an exciting area for me because, in fact, this is when I did the initial review of organic research that USDA has funded. This is work I've done with Organic Farming Research Foundation since about 2014. One of the most exciting things was the farmer participatory plant breeding networks that were developed with REI funding. And in this model, farmers and scientists collaborate to identify priorities, to evaluate existing germplasm, both commercial varieties and breeding lines and accessions and stuff that you might find in germplasm seed banks, etc., and then to develop and release new cultivars. And as I mentioned, the REI has funded several of these plant breeding endeavors for vegetables, for grains, dried beans, and other crops. There's one now for quinoa. And one of the things that's important to do is to always remember to select holistically. You want to select from multiple priorities at the same time. You want to maintain the yield and the market qualities as you are selecting for resilience to drought, to weed pressure, adaptation to your particular locale, etc. This is just another variety. This was actually evaluated by Commonwealth seed growers in Virginia. They don't just do squash and other cucurbits. They're looking at varieties of grain corn and looking at sweet peppers and tomatoes as well. So an example is the Northern Organic Vegetable Improvement Collaborative, or NOVIC. They just received their third round of funding, which is very exciting to me because this allows that long-term continuity that you really need to acquire, to develop the seed that we need. So this has been funded since 2010. Farmer Breeder Network hubs in 4 locations across the northern half of the country. Still waiting for the opportunity to get one launched in the southern half. I know that Organic Seed Alliance has been working on that a lot. Some cultivars that Novic has bred is Solstice Broccoli and another one called Myers Best. Myers is the principal investigator on the original Novic project. butternut squash, one called honey nut, and then some new lines that will be released this year. Tomatoes, Iron Lady, which I mentioned earlier, another one Brandywise, and here's several sweet corn varieties, all of which I've seen in the market. There's quite a bit more on the way. So farmer researcher collaboration, this variety of pea on the right is actually one that's been in existence, but it was on-farm variety trials that identified it as being really suitable for organic systems because it has disease resistance and really good eating quality. And this is Edmund Frost and several attendees to a field day that he held a couple of years ago. He works with a Cornell plant breeder, Dr. Michael Mazurek, who's been a major player in farmer participatory breeding of disease-resistant cucumbers, melons, and squash. We're looking at one of the squash lines that he's been evaluating. So a lot of enthusiasm for this approach. And this is a quote out of a report by some folks at Organic Seed Alliance that more than 70% of the organic seed research involved farmers. And one researcher said, we just couldn't do this without farmers. You know, to say they're helpful is not strong enough word. They're required. We need them in this. And there are a few challenges. Plant breeding is a highly skilled activity. There's a learning curve for farmers. And the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, the farmers must receive enough compensation to be able to continue doing this. I know that Edmund struggles from time to time to get funds. He's gotten funding from the SARE program and also from the OREI and also directly from OFRF itself recently. So that's been very good. But we do need to sustain the compensation for the farmers who are doing this valuable work. And cultivar development is a long-term process, at least 4, but typically 7 to 10 years from concept to a variety that's ready to be marketed, and then a couple of years to bring it to market, and that means seed increase, testing in different environments, and then the actual marketing tasks. So a few tips for finding seeds that you need to build your soil and make a good living. Make the best of what's available. Seek locally produced seed. And cultivars, if you see a cultivar that was bred by organic farmers and was bred for organic systems, that's likely to succeed. These traits of rapid early emergence, good competition with weeds, resistance to the diseases and other stresses in your region, that nutrient utilization, that's really important. That can make a tremendous difference in successful organic production. And it's always good to conduct on-farm variety comparisons and do it for several years in a row because seasons vary and you may get a different result one season to the next. But those simple on-farm comparisons are what lead farmers to choose what works best for them. So here's some sources for choosing organic seed. There's a directory of organic seed suppliers that the ATRA, National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service, provides. Also known as ATRA. Organic Seed Alliance itself is an excellent resource, and some really good vendors that provide information on cultivar traits. Blue River Organic Seeds, I just looked at their website recently, and it's fascinating. For every variety, they give you a score of 1 to 5 on a range of traits. Drought resistance, earliness, resistance to several diseases, etc. Yield and lower fertility soils. So that was a very interesting catalog. And then some of the vegetable seed catalogs, notably Southern Exposure Seed Exchange and Fedco Seeds, are really good at telling you not only the market traits, but sometimes the what are called agronomic traits, you know, what conditions it tolerates, how it performs in the field. Here's an example of a few descriptions. Gold Coast, that jumped out at me when I was thinking about these issues. Gold Coast okra, well-developed root system, has good drought and heat tolerance, as well as a tolerance to root knot nematodes. And those are all really important traits here in the South. And again, that root system is going to be directly contributing to soil health by adding organic matter. Sophie's Choice tomato, this is an interesting one. Quality is best in cooler climates, does not handle heat or drought well. So we might try it up here in the mountains where it doesn't get that hot. But if you're trying to grow tomatoes in Southern California or coastal South Carolina, that wouldn't be a good one to do. But Super Italian Paste tomato, this is interesting, withstood both flooding and drought. Danvers 126, I mentioned that before. It's suitable to clay soils because of its strong root system and then the strong tops. You say here it aids in harvesting, but I found it was mostly that it sustained production with, despite weeds. Here's another one, tender sweet carrot. This is a red flag if you do have the clay soil. It requires loose, deep soil to achieve its full potential. This is also valuable information, the so-called negatives. You say, well, you know, if I have cloddy soil or clay soil, maybe I don't want to do that one. So the next step is to get involved. You can grow, breed and grow better seed for organic farmers in your region. There are good resources, especially Organic Seed Alliance, and then some of the other small seed companies for learning seed production, cultivar evaluation, and plant breeding skills. And if you have a really good cultivar, you might just want to save and select your own seed from it. And always start with non-patented seed. Open source is best, or locally shared seeds. You can save your own seed from plant variety protection varieties. And if you do develop your own distinct variety, then that becomes yours to do with as you like. And then local seed swaps, a good way to get more interesting germplasm from local efforts. So Seed Savers Exchange is an excellent resource. You want to contract, you could also contract with the local seed companies to grow organic seeds. I know a number of farmers grow for Southern Exposure, some grow for Fedco seeds up in Maine. I'm sure there are lots of examples out west, but this is kind of my viewpoint here from Virginia. So, and then of course the Commonwealth Seeds seed growers is actually a network of farmers growing seeds and doing some breeding as well. So some resources for this, as I mentioned, Organic Seed Alliance. It has manuals and training workshops, variety trial information, proceedings from biannual Organic Seed Grower Conferences. There's been 9 so far, and I have just begun to look at these. It's a treasure trove of information. They provide technical support for a number of farmer-led breeding projects around the country. And they also maintain breeding populations that farmers can use for additional selection. Another one, Experimental Farm Network. I just found that online. They're doing upland rice, perennial grains, doing some unusual crops. And then the big three, and then others as well that you can link from the eOrganic and from Organic Seed Alliance, Novik, Tomi, CIOA. Another one, Kevin Murphy up in Washington State University has been doing what he calls evolutionary participatory plant breeding. This basically uses a very simple approach. It's not quite as efficient as some of the more sophisticated ones, but basically you go out and you plant something in a certain environment and you select what does well in that environment. You just do that year after year, and you're going to eventually making real progress. They're working with a range of specialty grains, barley, quinoa, spelt, and other specialty grains. And one thing I want to point out about these grain crops is that unlike vegetable crops, they are fairly high residue, and they're much better for building the soil than, say, beets or turnips or carrots, where you pull up the whole plant, take it to market, and the soil never sees a single bit of it except the root exudates that came out before harvest. So if you've got a vegetable crop rotation, you're having a hard time figuring out how to build soil and still not forego too much income growing cover crops and sod crops, you might look into one of these specialty grains where it's going to give you some income and is going to be providing a lot more residue return to the soil. Seed companies with participatory plant breeding programs include High Mowing, Johnny's, Commonwealth Seed Growers. I think there's a number out west as well. As I say, I'm less familiar with the particulars in that region. A few recent developments in the public plant breeding for organic. One thing I wanted to note is that the USDA Organic Research and Extension Initiative continues to emphasize as one of its priorities for applicants is strengthening organic crop seed systems, which include plant breeding, emphasizing this list of traits that we have been talking about, including performance in soil improving and climate friendly systems such as organic no-till. Organic no-till is very, very challenging. Even if you're doing it rotationally, you're crimping the cover crop and then you till down the cover crop residue to plant, the cash crop harvest, and then you roll crimp the cover crop to plant your next cash crop. Even that system can run into a lot of challenges in terms of nutrient availability and weed competition and also just getting the crop established, getting it to come up through that residue where the soil might be a little cooler or the soil seed contact not quite as perfect. Breeding may play a role in making this system more workable and therefore make this very excellent soil building system more accessible to our growers. And cover crop breeding is now an explicit part of this priority as well. So what's in the news about the OREI? The good news is that this year's awards include that third funding for Novik, which I was really excited to see, and the second round of funding for Dr. Mirsky and the cover crop breeding, and ongoing funding of other plant breeding and cultivar evaluation efforts. The downside is that the Farm Bill has been delayed. The Congress has not yet been able to complete a Farm Bill, and as of last September 2018, the end of the month, funding for OREI has been suspended. Now, anything that has gone out already, any project that has been awarded, including 2018, will be allowed to continue unaffected. However, OREI, National Institute for Food and Agriculture, which administers OREI, cannot issue any more requests for applications for this or other Farm Bill programs until a new Farm Bill passes. Again, flipping back to the positive, one thing that is true about the current Farm Bill, both the House and the Senate versions propose increases in funding for OREI. Now, the Senate has a better provision. It increases all the way to $50 million a year, which not only greatly expands the program, but makes it permanent. Any program that is more than $50 million a year is allowed to continue even when there is a delay in the next Farm Bill. So if we get it to that level, it will not again be suspended. Now, it's good for plant breeding and for organic research in general. Okay, just a couple of quick look into the future. Some promising cultivars in the pipeline. As I mentioned, the Tomi project has some resistant cultivars that are resistant to 6 major fungal and bacterial diseases. I think bacterial speck and bacterial spot were among them. Those are problems that can be really serious problems in some areas. The carrot project has developed improved red and purple carrots, and they have some breeding stock that shows resistance to 2 major pest nematodes. If you ever have forking in your carrots, I used to think that was caused by the carrots growing in rocky or clay soil. It's actually nematodes. They disrupt the formation of the root. And of course, more severe nematode pressure will greatly reduce the yield as well as the shape of the carrot. There's several new sweet corn varieties coming out through Novik, including one that's specifically adapted to the Olympic Peninsula, and that is one rainy climate. So it's a short growing season, short window to get a sweet corn crop out there. So that's that'll be a valuable addition to seed supply in that region. And there are new varieties of a number of other vegetables as well. Thank you for the following organizations. These are all the different groups that have supported OFRF. The Clarence Heller Foundation is specifically underwriting this webinar series. California Department of Food and Agriculture, USDA's, of course, the Risk Management Agency and Western SARE have supported our work. And then all these other several private companies who are providing organic foods. Thank you very much.